Hello and welcome to GameSack. Let's take a look at some games that make the hardware that they run on look weak. Basically the opposite of the pushing hardware limits concept. That's right, my big brain can come up with some pretty genius ideas. First, let's take a look at some NES games developed by Micronix. And have they ever written any code that wasn't crippled? Alright, let's start with 1942, published by Capcom in 1986 for the NES. This is a vertical shooter based on the exciting year 1942, where of course World War II is happening. The enemy is the Japanese fleet. Yes, this game was designed and programmed in Japan. It's a good idea to avoid enemy bullets and also the enemies themselves. Touching either will result in your immediate demise. You can avoid these things by simply staying out of the way or pressing the A button, which causes you to do a loop. This will give you a couple seconds to reposition yourself. The main issue with this one is that the entire game only runs at 20 frames per second. Yep, the scrolling, your movement, the enemy's movement, their bullets, it's all pretty jittery. This all leads to lag in the controls and can make things tough to avoid sometimes, in addition to just making it look pretty bad. If that's not enough, the sound is extremely irritating. You get a monotone beep that keeps happening again and again and again in the stage. How did anyone think that this was okay? Granted, the original arcade that this was ported from sounded pretty bad as well. The game actually does have what resembles some decent music when you respawn from a death or clear a stage though. 1943 came to the NES 2 years later, developed by Capcom themselves this time, as near as I can find. It's just so much better in every single way. If you need to play a 1940 shooter on the NES, play this one, not 1942. Or how about Ghosts and Goblins, also published by Capcom? Okay, I admit that this game is kind of fun. Yes, even the NES version here. But man, is it janky. You basically get the same 20 frames per second action here. But wait, the sprites and the backgrounds don't update at the same time. Not only that, but it can be a bit inconsistent when the sprites do update. This makes the entire presentation feel extremely sloppy. But you can kind of get used to it, and like I said, it can be kind of fun. At least I think so. Still, if you had an NES and all your friends came over and saw this game, they'd laugh at you and leave because they wouldn't want to be friends with someone who had such a weak console. I'm kidding, of course, that wouldn't happen. Instead, we'd all play the game until we beat it, not knowing any better. So yeah, it's janky, but they did include diagonal scrolling without a special chip in the cartridge. So while the game definitely looks weak, it can actually be kind of impressive given the circumstances. Another good example from Micronix is Ikari Warriors, which was published by SNK. Oh boy, this one's a lot worse. You've got similar jank to what we saw in Ghosts and Goblins, but here the frame rate is even lower, hovering around 15 frames per second and sometimes even less. Moving things around on screen was not something that Micronix was particularly adept at. What's more is that this game plays fast and loose with the collision detection. Okay, sorry, the word fast should be nowhere when talking about Ikari Warriors on the NES. So when you're flashing, you're invincible. When you're not flashing, that means you're going to be dead in a few seconds, and then you'll be flashing again. You can't do a whole lot to avoid it. Micronix seems to have realized this and given the player a cheat code to continue. Simply press ABBA when you run out of lives. There's no way you can mess this code up, even if you accidentally press something else first. I guess it was just easier to add this than fix the game to make it somewhat playable. Sadly, this makes the game extremely boring, but even without it, the game isn't any good. Oh, Micronix, how we do not miss you. These next 3 games are on a pot-pourri of different consoles. That's right, I know some fancy words thanks to my big brain. Here's Extreme Pinball for the original PlayStation, brought to you by Electronic Arts. Do you like video pinball? Well, you might want to stay away from this one. There are 4 different boards here, and honestly, some of their designs aren't bad. But the presentation makes it quite difficult to play and even more difficult to enjoy. The game moves at 30 frames per second, half of what it should run at. That's right, in case you haven't noticed, low frame rates are practically a theme for this episode. Now, 30 frames per second may not sound awful, but on a pinball game, it's a huge sin. It makes it very difficult to focus on both the board and the ball as it scrolls up and down. But seriously though, what the hell? The PlayStation is a 32-bit console and it can't scroll a simple 2D backdrop and a ball smoothly? The PlayStation is truly a piece of crap. The Sega Genesis is way more powerful. Or you might think these things if you were simply judging by this game. Also, it doesn't help that the green graphics keep overlaying the playfield, making it even more difficult to keep track of what's at the bottom of the screen as it scrolls down. Another thing about this one are the loading times. Going to any board will result in a loading screen of just over a minute. Loading the Rock Fantasy board took 1 minute and 16 seconds to load. I thought my PlayStation had frozen, or maybe even died. Loading from any board back to the options screen will take around 37 seconds. It's insane. Imagine if this was the first game on CD you ever played. You'd probably think, yeah, okay, I'll stick with cartridge games forever, thanks. Most, if not all, 16-bit pinball games are better than this.
Link 1. You are in violation.
Here's Commando on the NES from Capcom. For the longest time, I thought that this was another game developed by Micronix, but no. Looks like Capcom made this one themselves. The gameplay here is very similar to Ikari Warriors. Well, I mean, except for the fact that this game is tons of fun. Looking at the clues, it just can't be Micronix. For one, this game moves at 60 frames per second, well, mostly. This game certainly has its jank, though a different kind of jank. You see, every few seconds, the screen will jump for a single frame and then fix itself immediately. It does this on any scrolling screen throughout the entire game. There are some static screens here and there in the game where it doesn't happen at all. Who the hell knows why it does this, but it does. Must be an issue in the coding of the scrolling routine. It makes the game feel rather glitchy. It certainly doesn't seem like it should be doing this, but no, this is normal for this game, and I haven't really seen anyone else mention it. Sometimes it'll even flash garbage tiles on screen for a single frame. Did you see that? Here's what it flashed. It makes it feel like the cartridge is dirty, or maybe my NES is dying. There's some pretty messed up code in this one, and I'm honestly surprised that they didn't fix it before releasing it. My guess is that the issue is buried deep and might have needed a complete rewrite and there just wasn't enough time. The game also has lots of sprite flicker because it puts so many enemies on screen, maybe more than they should for a home port of an arcade game, but this isn't surprising. I can't wait until Displaced Gamers eventually takes a look at this game and its code. By the way, check out Displaced Gamers for deep dives into why some of the other NES games that I've mentioned today perform the way that they do. Despite Commando's glitchiness, which makes the game feel like it could freeze or crash at any second, this is tons of fun and you should absolutely play it. I hate to mention the original Gex, but it really does make the 3DO look extraordinarily weak. This is a simple 2D game with simple parallax scrolling effects. There's certainly not much going on here that the Super Nintendo couldn't do. Yet here we are on a super powerful 32-bit console and the game can only run at 30 frames per second. It sometimes slows down to a bit less than that if things get too crazy for the 3DO. I mean, I guess things are already too crazy for the console if it can't pull off smoother scrolling than this. I also want to drive home the point that this wasn't Crystal Dynamics' first game for the console. So what could be the issue? Maybe the 3DO just can't scroll 2D smoothly? Well, actually it can. Look at Super Street Fighter II Turbo here running at a silky smooth 60 frames per second. But wait, hold up, something's amiss. There's only a single layer of scrolling in this one. There's no parallax. Maybe the 3DO has issues when multiple layers are on screen in a 2D game. Nope! Look at Soccer Kid. This decidedly abysmal experience has no issues scrolling multiple overlapping layers at 60 frames per second. Both of these games were released a while before Gex, by the way. So, what happened with Gex? Who knows, but I immediately noticed it back in the day when I bought it. So did the game magazines, well, at least the ones with eyeballs anyway. Apparently GameFan here didn't employ anyone with eyeballs. What the hell, GameFan? If anyone should have noticed this, it's you. If, for whatever reason, you want to play the original Gex, play it on the PlayStation or even the Saturn for a full-on 60 frames per second experience. These came out later that same year. But whatever you do, stay far away from the 3DO version here.
It's tail time! I'm so hungry I could cry.
Next are a bunch of Genesis games. Sadly, there was no minimum standard to be met when making games for this console, at least the Western developed games. However, this first game was actually made in Japan, and it's a decently faithful port from the arcade on which it's based. Still kinda sad looking though. Here's on the Genesis from Sage's Creation. It was actually developed by Sega. Your job is to destory the enemy facilities. You do this by planting bombs on the conveniently placed X's throughout each stage. Once you get them all, escape before the timer runs out and the place is destoried. The game looks weak mainly due to its design. You're supposed to play with a friend and each of you has their very own view for whatever reason. But even in single player mode, you're relegated to basically a quarter of the screen. The graphics are all extremely simplistic and tiny. Even with that, there can be some slowdown. Play in 2-player mode and, well, it's pretty much always running slow. The game itself is pretty fun though. Granted, it can be kinda tough in spots, like here. What the hell? Come on! Also, the music is pretty good in some of the stages. I just think that this would work much better in full screen with bigger characters and both players on the same screen. Put the map on the pause screen. As it is, it doesn't feel much like a 16-bit game, but give it a go because it's actually pretty fun. This is The Fairy Tale Adventure on the Genesis from Electronic Arts. Wow, they'd port anything over to the Genesis back then. Look how this guy handles his weapon. You can already tell that this isn't going to be very good. You wander around doing who knows what. I've never played this game for more than a few minutes. And that's because this isn't why I bought a Genesis. At its absolute maximum, this game only runs at 15 frames per second. The Genesis wasn't very old at the time and the Super Nintendo wasn't even out, so why are you porting ancient games like this? People are expecting more. The scrolling part only uses about half of the screen, so I don't know why it's chugging so badly. Well, I do know why, and just like with the rest of the games in this episode, it's inexperienced, unoptimized, and/or buggy coding. This could be the result of bad development tools, and from what I understand, each developer had to build their own back in the day. Oh, and it doesn't help that you walk so damn close to the edge either. Why? No one likes that. The graphics are all extremely simple. The audio is horrible, and you'd never know that the Genesis can do some excellent sound and music just by listening to this game. Well, sadly you could say that about a great many Genesis games. Do you want to pause the game and go take a massive dump? Well, screw you! You can't just press start, that button does nothing! Instead, you need to cycle through the menus to pause it. By the time you've done that, you've already soiled yourself. So yeah, they didn't spend very much time optimizing this one at all. Here's Captain Planet and the Planeteers for the Mega Drive. This was based on a cartoon and thankfully only released in PAL regions. Oh dear lord. You play as 4 different teenagers. Your first goal is to help Kwame get out of Duke Nukem's uranium mine? Yeah, right away the game wants to remind you that you could be playing something better. The 2D Duke Nukem games existed a year before this title came out. But in the game's defense, the Captain Planet cartoon show had a Duke Nukem character before the first Duke Nukem game came out.
Beware, world. Duke Nukem is sizzling.
Anyways, you can see the game looks hideous in every regard. It can scroll at full speed sometimes, but not consistently. It's always wanting to drop a few frames every second or so. The artwork is just laughable. You'd certainly never think that this console can do some of the fantastic visuals that we've seen in other Genesis games. This is a Western developed game, and yes, it uses the GEMS sound driver for painful results. Is this the same console that did amazing music like Thunder Force 4 and Streets of Rage? Surely not. What I've shown you so far is bad enough, but now for the Coup de Grace. This sewer level has some of the worst audio ever heard in a video game. They try to make the rats crawling around sound like, I'm not sure, but it sounds like my Genesis is drowning in a giant vat of diarrhea. Oh man, no wonder the console gets such a bad rep when it comes to audio. It's an absolute shame that games like this were permitted to exist. This is Will Harvey's Zany Golf on the Genesis from Electronic Arts. How the hell have I not had this game featured in this series yet? This was, of course, ported from a computer game. It was actually ported entirely by just one guy. Oh, and this was back when Electronic Arts wasn't an official third-party developer, so they had to reverse engineer the console to even figure out how it worked. But can you imagine if this was the only game that you ever played on the machine? The playfield itself takes up maybe half of the screen. It doesn't extend to any of the TV's borders. And this game runs at 10 frames per second, sometimes as low as 5. And playing this one makes the Genesis feel like it's even struggling to perform that well. You'd think that the Genesis here was less powerful than the Master System and the NES. The audio isn't good, but it's not as bad as we've heard from the other Genesis games in this episode. Regardless of all this, the game can still be kind of fun. But it would be a hell of a lot more enjoyable with a frame rate that was 10 times as fast, which is certainly possible if this were remade from the ground up. Okay, this last segment is full of racing games. These types of games are often used to show off the power of a console. Well, you don't want to judge the power of a console based on these games. Here's Cyber Speedway on the Saturn from Sega and NEX. This is the first Death Sled racing game ever. It's also an extremely early game on the console. And woo boy, does it ever look sloppy. Granted, nobody really knew what they were doing with the console back then. But they tried to give us some fun titles while they learned, and they figured that Death Sled racing was the genre of the future. Literally. You simply can't have a Death Sled racing game that's not set in a dystopian future. That'd be wrong. This one features ugly textures that warp when they get close, some nasty looking dithering here and there, and pop-up, flicker, and draw-in that is tough to ignore. The game's main issue is that the heavily advertised Wipeout was set to debut on the PlayStation, and it was just mere months away. So, which looks better to you? The game on the left or the one on the right? If you were judging a console based on these two, which console would you likely buy? Sega didn't advertise this one very much because they knew it wouldn't compare favorably in any way. Curiously, they did spend some money to change the soundtrack to appeal to Americans, I guess, with some singing. game itself isn't horrible. In fact, I personally enjoy playing this one a bit more than the very first Wipeout. But I'm sure more than a few people saw this and laughed as they bought their PlayStations. This is RPM Racing, or Radical Psycho Machine Racing, on the Super NES from Interplay. Yeah, this game was in a Pushing Hardware Limits episode a couple of years ago. And that's because it's one of the very few games on the console which runs in high resolution. But like I said in that video, it could also be featured in a Games That Make the Console Look Weak episode. And well, here it is. Why is it here? Well, look at it! There's barely any detail at all and it still runs poorly. It averages around 17 frames per second. It doesn't help that this is another game that forces the two-player split screen on you even when you're playing single player. I think it would run better if that weren't the case. I'll never understand why some games chose to do this. But even if it were running around 30 frames per second, it would still be slow and it would still look like absolute ass. If they ran it in a normal resolution, I bet it could be a silky smooth 60 frames per second. Or maybe not. These very same developers did Rock and Roll Racing here 2 years later and got rid of the Force 2-player, ran the game in the console standard resolution, and they still max out at 20 frames per second, even when you're the only one on screen. But at least it moves faster, I guess. These games make the Super Nintendo look like it has issues scrolling a simple screen around. This is Cosmic Race on the PlayStation from Neo Rex. This was a launch game for the console in Japan and it was only ever released there. This is also the only game Neo Rex has ever made. I've never heard of this one before. Seems kind of basic so far. Let's give it a go. Dear Lord and his special friend Christ, what the freaking crap is going on here? How the heavenly hell do you control this? Seriously. Oh man, this game is awkward. Okay. After messing with it for a bit, I come to find that the directional pad doesn't even steer. That's right, you steer left and right with the square and circle buttons. If that's not bad enough, when you let go, your craft bounces back the other direction for a bit. The D-pad strafes you left and right. You move up and down with either the D-pad or the triangle and X buttons. Gas is R1, but it really only works decently when you're between the red barriers on the track. You have an SLD number at the bottom left which decreases as you bump into things, which is super easy to do. If it reaches 0, it's game over. I eventually did well enough to finish a race and what the purgatory? Why am I still moving around? Seriously, damn it, I won! What did I do wrong? Oh good, the guy behind me won. Game over. What an incredibly stupid game. But that's not why we're here today, is it? I mean, you can see why we're here. The graphics are extremely basic and ugly. So basic in fact that it's said that the game took many of its textures straight from the basic developer's kit for the console. It runs at 20 frames per second with some occasional screen tearing. Oh wait, I must be wrong, because the game seems to have its very own frames per second counter. Look at that, over 350 frames per second! Surely that's what that number means. Imagine your Japanese parents getting you a brand new PlayStation on day one and this game. Only this game. What do you think your reaction would be? I think you'd probably throw away your PlayStation and disown your parents. This whole experience is dreadful. And there you go, more games that make the console that they run on look weak. Now, this is the part of the episode where I generically sum up my thoughts and then I ask you what are some of the games that you think make the console look weak and to let me know. This is also the part of the video where I thank you for watching GameSack, I roll credits, and that's followed by an end sketch showcasing a failed attempt at humor.
Here's a little old game set. Come to look at me. Let me slip some stuff out for you, fat boy. Here it is. You like that? I only speak the truth.
Hello?